This is the Little Moments Count radio podcast, created in partnership with community radio stations throughout Minnesota. Each episode, you'll hear interviews with early childhood experts on how to support the important brain development that takes place in the first 1,000 days of life, just through little moments every day. Learn more at littlemomentscount.org/podcast. And you are listening to WFNU LP 94.1 FM. That's Frogtown Community Radio. You could be listening on FM at 94.1 FM or on WFNU's very own smartphone app. And as always, we are online at WFNU.org. And welcome to So St. Paul, a show that is all about, you guessed it, our favorite city, our capital city, St. Paul, Minnesota, and all the great things and people and events that are happening in our fabulous city. I'm your host, Katie DeSell, and I am here every Thursday afternoon from 5 to 5:30 p.m. to bring you the best that St. Paul has to offer. I am so excited because today we have a very special guest, Dr. Michael Arenson. I want to let you know that this episode of So St. Paul is presented in partnership with Minnesota Public Radio and Little Moments Count. Little Moments Count is a statewide collaborative focused on helping parents and caregivers learn about the importance of brain development in the first 3 years of life for a child. Nearly 80% of brain growth happens in the first 1,000 days, and small moments of interaction like talking, playing, reading, and singing help create the pathways that build a child's brain during this early stage of life. For more information, you can visit littlemomentscount.org. WFNU is excited to be partnering with Little Moments Count to host conversations focused on early childhood development. We'll be welcoming a new guest each month to talk about their involvement in Little Moments Count and how they view the role of early childhood development in creating bright futures and strong communities. On today's show, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Arenson. Dr. Arenson recently returned to Minneapolis, where he grew up and always called home, which we won't hold against him over here in St. Paul. He graduated from Emory University for medical school, where he also earned a master's in bioethics and a master of science in clinical research. He completed his pediatric residency at the University of Washington and Seattle's Children's Hospital, and most recently finished fellowships in child health equity research and early relational health at UMass. Now at Hennepin Healthcare, Michael provides outpatient and newborn care while also helping build new clinical and research programs focused on trauma-responsive, family-centered care. A pediatrician and researcher deeply committed to advancing child health equity, Michael's work focuses on how systems can better support strong, nurturing relationships between young children and their caregivers, especially those navigating poverty, housing instability, foster care, or other relational disruptions. Michael is also co-editing the first pediatric textbook on developmental trauma and resilience. He's passionate about using research to inform policy and practice that help all kids and families thrive. Welcome, Dr. Michael Arenson. Can you first start off by introducing yourself and giving me a little bit of your background?
Michael Arenson. I'm a pediatrician at Hennepin Healthcare in the clinic and specialty center downtown. I see kids in the outpatient setting for checks and other sort of acute visits. And then I also spend time in the nursery, about 10 weekends a year in the newborn nursery. That's kind of part of my clinical duties. I spend 4 days a week in clinic and then 10 weekends a year in the nursery. And then 1 day a week is allocated to research, with the idea or goal being creating a research program that can advance the work that we're talking about today, basically.
Thank you. So what first drew you into pediatrics and the early years of life of children?
I think I've always had kids and their sort of growth and the fun that they have, the sort of pure joy that they exude has always been a bit of a gravity for me, like so many other people. I was trying to decide between becoming a high school biology teacher or a doctor and struggled with that decision for a long time, but ultimately chose the medical school route, became a pediatrician. And throughout the whole time, I always had an eye not only on the sort of individual clinic visit, but saw that there were sort of these systems level issues that really sometimes got in the way of that sort of stymied our best intentions of trying to promote health and well-being for everyone. And I'm also interested in that kind of systems level piece as well, and have been for a while.
And can you explain a little bit more about the systems level piece? What are the systems that you're trying to navigate around?
Yeah. I wonder if it might be even better to, in order to answer that question, back up a little bit and say what we're trying to promote is positive, nurturing, love relationships. And we can, of course, talk more about like why that is. But when you think about relationships, they exist everywhere, both in your deep sort of emotional connections to your family and your relatives and your close friends and peers, but and teachers, for example, but they also exist in these sort of almost seemingly unimportant micro moments that you to the cashier at the coffee shop or someone who opens the door for you just or keeps the door open for you as they're walking in. And so we're just constantly immersed in bathed in relationships. And for a baby, that's really important because they can't really do anything on their own. They need relationship. They need a relationship with someone to help them survive. Okay, so why do I start there for systems? It's because when you think about how all of these people who work in all of these different sectors at different levels, so whether they're the cashier at the register or your parent giving you care, that's like the interpersonal level. And but then you zoom out, you have organizations, and then you have and within communities, within states, within countries. We are at multiple levels and across multiple sectors constantly engaged in relationship, and those relationships impact our ability to be in relationship with other people. For example, if you are living in a part of town that doesn't have any walking paths, that is not well lit, doesn't have much green space, it's difficult to engage with people outside your door. It's difficult to push the stroller, for example, in a safe way. And so that changes how we relate with each other.
So, how does that affect a young child or a newborn baby, these relationships?
So the baby is, like I said, and like everyone knows, babies need help they need to borrow, they need help to grow and develop. A baby cries and they need comforting, or they need to be fed, or they need to be changed. So what this boils down to is they need help regulating their bodies. And this is the insight that looking at sort of the babe child caregiver interaction provides us is it helps us really boil a lot of the research boils it down to this sort of relationship, these behaviors, these actions that help each person regulate the other. And it starts in from our earliest days, not just after the baby's born, but in utero. And that regulation, because babies need help regulating, there are different ways to do that. But ultimately, they have to trust that you have their best interest in mind and that you can be in tune with their needs, can read their signals. And so that's what the relationship starts as. And that's why it's important is being in tune and being able to understand what's going on in the baby's mind and what they need to help them regulate and grow and develop in the healthiest way possible.
Yeah. How can parents and caregivers create more of these interactions and relationships with their young children?
The first thing to say about that, I think, is that there's no right way per se. Those relationships that we were just talking about are very much influenced the behaviors that each caregiver, child, dyad, the behaviors that they have are very culturally rooted. And there's many cultures, and I don't just mean the way that we typically think of culture. Each family has their own culture within each community, which has its own culture, within it's this kind of collective whole that has its own culture, and there's no right behavior, but there seem to be some useful a useful framework or like useful principles, and one of them is that you take time to in place with the kid. I know it sounds funny, but we forget that relationships are better when you're together in the same place. And there's a lot of benefits from being on Zoom, for example, these days, but you're not going to have the best dinner party over Zoom. You gather in the same place. And so it's really about being, and people call this embodied, because it's like putting your body through the motions of being in a relationship. And so it's a very embodied process. And so touching and singing and hugging and kissing and cuddling when you're reading books, for example, those are key experiences that the child gets or that you can do to create that relationship. And then honestly, a lot about relationship boils down to the feeling of safety. And so if the baby feels safe, if they feel, if they feel seen, and if they feel like they matter to you, and if you feel like you matter to them, that is actions that you take to show them that are the way that you build that relationship. And like I said, there's no one way, but they ultimately have to they usually have to be embodied, and they usually have to help the person feel safe and seen and heard.
We talk a lot about with Little Moments Count how important the first 3 years of life is for a child and that 80% of brain growth happens during that time. What happens if during that time there is not a lot of interaction and there's some trauma that happens during that time? Is there steps afterwards that parents or caregivers can take to help these children that have not had that early interaction and needed relationships?
Yeah, that's like kind of the big question. And I have to say I'm a pediatrician. I'm not a neurobiologist or a psychologist. I'm sure people could explain this better than me on a sort of biologic level. But from my putting my pediatrician hat on, there's a lot in that question, and we deal with it every day in the clinic. And it's almost a philosophical question because there's so many times where I might meet a family and I have the ability to choose what to value most in that visit. I have to prioritize. And there may be a lot of risks, let's say, as you said, like trauma, which probably deserves its own conversation about what exactly is trauma, because we throw the word around a lot and sometimes I don't know what we're talking about necessarily. And so maybe delving into that at some point. But if there's a lot of potentially traumatic things going on, let's say, or concerns that I might have, I still have a choice about what to focus on in in the goal of trying to help this family and this child thrive. And so we talked about some of those experiences that build relationship, and they're embodied, they are in person, they help the other person that feel safe, seen, heard. And so when I see a family with a young child experiencing potentially traumatic events, I have to choose what I do. Do I focus on the negative, or do I promote the positive? One way we've created to think of one way that my mentor at UMass, her name's Heather Forkey, the bumper sticker, so to speak, is we're trying what I've chosen to do in my practice is not sum the suffering, but build the buffering.
Hmm.
And the buffering is the sort of protective. What I mean by buffering is the protective role that relationships play. Okay, so how that doesn't really answer your question. So let me now back up and answer your question. Yes, so like early childhood is growth is explosive. Brains are creating, I can't remember the exact amount of connections each second in the brain, but it is astounding. And you can get a sense of how much brain growth there is in the early years when you look at pictures of children's brains who, who have unfortunately passed. And when they examine the brains of, for example, a premature child, like a 26-week child versus a term child, it is, it's just, it's mind blowing how much change there is in just that short amount of time. And then let alone in the first 1, 2, 3, and frankly, even 4, 5, 6 years, there's just so much growth. And so that's why we care about these relationships early in life, because they are a child who can't regulate well, who doesn't get their needs met, who doesn't feel safe. They're going to divert a lot of energy towards the behaviors that help them stay safe and help protect them, but not necessarily divert that energy towards the higher level sort of growth and development. And they certainly won't learn how to, if they don't get the proper sort of social connection and relationship in childhood, they won't learn how to relate to others and trust others. And as we already talked about, every single day we're immersed in relationships, whether it's with our caregivers, our teachers, or the person who, or the cashier down the street in the grocery store or the coffee shop. And so, for that person, the best thing that I can do as a pediatrician is not necessarily sum up all the suffering that kid has had, even though I wish that it might have been different, but start now with showing them what relationship is like and help buffer and support. And the word that we oftentimes use is scaffold the relationship that exists and draw attention to and observe the strengths that both people have and the strength of their relationship, because there's three separate entities. There's each individual, of course, but then there's the relationship that they have, and I can leverage all three.
Got it. Bringing it back to navigating the systems, as we talked about in the beginning of the interview, can you go back to that? And now that we have a little bit more background about why these relationships are so important, how does that relate to the systems?
So those moments of connection happen everywhere in our society. They obviously happen at home, but they also happen at school. They happen in the pediatrician's office. They happen on the bus to the grocery store. They happen, or sometimes they don't happen because of other things, like a parent has been deported, a parent is gone for much of the day and night because they have to work multiple jobs. It might be that the parent is struggling with substance addiction, and that is drawing their attention away. And frankly, it might be happening because we're all on our phones all the time and our eyeballs are not on the outside world. I myself have been walking across a crosswalk and been honked at because my eyes are on my phone. Now imagine if you're doing that next to your kid who's in the same place as you, but our eyeballs aren't on them. So the moments of connection happen everywhere. And so what are we as a society or as a system doing to help people create and build strong moments of connection? That's how it's related to society and systems. Just the other day, for example, a mom came in with her 7-week old and her 7-year-old kids, and her dad and her husband had gone to court, asked to. He did everything he was asked to, went to court, and he didn't come home. And that is a relational rupture, to say the least. Not only does the mom not have the buffering as relationship, but the kids are also dealing with that rupture of relationship. And so you have the justice system and the immigration system now overlapping with the pediatric system because they're in my office. And of course, interacting with the social safety net system and the housing system because they now lost the person who made the money for the most part in the home because mom was staying home to take care of the 7-week-old baby. She had just given birth. And so she was not working at that time, although she had worked in the past. You have the employment job sector And so that, I think, probably is a reasonable way to show that each system is connected through, but through these relationships, through our sort of interpersonal bonds.
Yeah, it's gotta be tough. Obviously, it's tough for the woman and her family losing the father, but it's also has to be tough for you to see these things and to not know how to move forward in situations where these systems are broken and you can't fix them yourself. I'm sure a lot of other people feel like that raising children where so you can't really do anything about the systems that are around you. But what can parents do to help their children? If you were to give advice to a new parent or even a parent who's got like a 3-year-old who feels their hands are tied, they can't fix these other systems that are outside of them, what can they do like in the home to help their children?
It's a great question. Those moments of connection don't have to be perfect, is what I would say. It's, are they good enough? Are they good enough moments of connection, given all the other things that we as adults and caregivers and teachers and and radio show hosts are we doing are we we're all holding a lot right now, but are those moments of connection good enough? And by that, we're not always going to get it. And I'm sure you've talked to someone on this radio show about, at some point, rupture and repair. But for audience members who don't know what that means, it's essentially, a lot of this work was pioneered by Ed Tronick, who I have the good fortune of knowing well. He did these amazing experiments where they call them the face experiments, and they put the baby, the 6-month-old baby, and it was oftentimes the mom, and they were sitting right across from each other, 6 feet, 2 to 4 feet away from each other, and they would interact, and then the mom was instructed to keep her face still. So essentially cutting off that embodied sort of communication that we give to our children. And so she kept her face totally still and her body still, and she was not able to respond to the baby's cues and the signals saying, "Hey, what's going on? Can we interact? Can we be in rhythm still?" And when that happened, you just see what happens to the child. They get totally dysregulated. And then ultimately she's instructed to resume play, and you see how they get back into rhythm over time. And so what those experiments did for us was help us understand the role that repair, the role that when you become mismatched, you're not in sync, you're out of rhythm, the role that getting back into rhythm plays for the building resilience for the children. They feel uncomfortable, they feel upset, they are dysregulated, but then the parent ultimately reconnects, or they reconnect with each other because it's a two-way street. But they reconnect, they get back into sync, and that happens over and over again, and to a point where the kid learns, oh, I can go through and do hard things. My parent won't always be in sync with me, but they will come back to me. They will do their best to get back in rhythm. And so the part about development that we don't talk about in medicine, and let alone anywhere else in society, probably except for early childhood, who are probably the early childhood caregivers and teachers who are probably the experts at this, is recognizing that you're not always going to be in sync. You do a good enough job, but you fail sometimes. And sometimes you fail over the course of days or weeks, or or longer, even if, you're a parent who might be dealing with some other major issues. But you can always repair, you can always come back, and you can always show them, like, you matter to me.
Mm.
And it's not easy. In fact, it's super hard, but that repair kind of piece is huge here. So in the home, are you having good enough moments of connection? And are you doing your best to repair? Is a really good rule of thumb when you are out of connection.
That's fantastic, Michael. I wish we had more time. I would love to have you back on at another time, but I really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure, Katie. Thank you for inviting me. It was fun.
Thank you so much to Dr. Michael Arenson for coming on So St. Paul today and talking with us about the importance of the first 1,000 days of life for a child. So St. Paul airs every Thursday from 5 to 5:30 p.m. right here on WFNU LP 94.1 FM. It's Frogtown Community Radio. I'm your host, Katie DeSalle. Every Thursday, I bring you the best that St. Paul has to offer. And I want to thank Little Moments Count and Minnesota Public Radio for partnering with us on this program. Thank you for listening. You can hear a recording of this show at littlemomentscount.org/podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Little Moments Count, you can visit their website at littlemomentscount.org. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Little Moments Count radio podcast in partnership with community radio stations throughout Minnesota. You can find the Little Moments Count radio podcast wherever you get your podcasts and at littlemomentscount.org/podcast.